All right, everyone, it's about 10:04 and we do not want to delay any longer. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you everyone again to the Guinn Center's First Look webinar on K-12 education funding in Nevada. Again, I'm Christine Gallagher, Assistant Director of the Guinn Center, and I am so pleased to welcome you and to facilitate today's conversation. I know many of you on the call are familiar with the Guinn Center, but I'd like to kick things off today by focusing on our why, the reason we do what we do. This illustration, which is admittedly meant to make us laugh a little bit, shows us what political and policy discourse often looks like. Depending on what side of the aisle someone may be on, their life experiences, or the stories of the people they know, we can look at the same issues and have two completely different perspectives, not only about the root causes of our challenges, but the solutions to remedy them. And the Guinn Center exists to widen this lens and to help all of us see the bigger picture, to see the data and the facts independent from political influence and make informed decisions to improve Nevada's laws and Nevadans' lives. The Guinn Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research center serving the entire state of Nevada, studying everything from the economy and tax policy to health and social policy to education, providing trusted, data-driven policy recommendations for lawmakers and government officials to consider as they govern our state. Since 2013, we've produced more than 100 policy reports, briefs, and other research. In fact, before the 2025 legislative session begins, we will have released 22 major reports, policy briefs, and fact sheets. We've been busy. Later this fall, we're set to release our study on housing affordability, looking at policy considerations as Nevada lawmakers address this critical issue. And we just released several voter education briefs ahead of the general election. We cover topics like mail ballots, Nevada's voter registration systems, and ballot question 3 to inform voters as they hit the polls. Please, I encourage you to visit our website and read and share all of these resources with your networks. Before we get started on today's discussion, I do have a couple of housekeeping items for us. So first, go ahead and keep your microphones muted if you would. We have a lot of people on the call today and probably more to come, and we want to eliminate as many distractions as possible. If you have questions during the call, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A tool on Zoom. And this is preferred over the chat tool. I just want to underscore that. Please use the Q&A tool. I'll monitor your questions and I'll do my best to get as many of those answered as possible during our time of Q&A at the end of the call. And we may, if we have time, invite you to unmute and ask your questions live. So we'll just go ahead and play it by ear together. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce you to our Director of Education, Dr. Anna Colquitt, and our GIS specialist, Robin Evans, to give us a first look at our report on Nevada's Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. Anna?
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for attending. We are so excited to be sharing our newest education report with you all today. So I am so pleased to be sharing a first look at our report on the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, which we titled Examining School Funding in Nevada, Equity in Education and Policy Considerations. And this was all based on research that was funded by ARP-ESSER funds through the Nevada Department of Education. So prior to getting into the report, I want to quickly introduce the core team of researchers that were involved in this project. So as Christine mentioned, I am Anna Colquitt, and I have the honor of serving as the Director of Education Policy for the Guinn Center. Our other researchers included Todd Butterworth, who is the Senior Education Researcher at the Guinn Center, Dr. Jennifer McClendon, who is a faculty member in the College of Education at the University of Nevada, Reno, and Kashifa, who is a graduate researcher in the College of Education, also at the University of Nevada, Reno, and then Robin Evans, who you will hear from later today as she introduces our GIS tool, and she is our GIS specialist for the Guinn Center. I'm sure most of us have heard about the incredible education investment that was made in 2023 of $2.6 billion. That is a lot of money, and yet these numbers are still our reality. So in 2025, Nevada's average per pupil allocation sits at just over $13,000, which is significantly lower than the national average of over $17,000. Even more concerning, experts from APA recommend a funding amount of over $17,000 per student to ensure adequate education outcomes. So this $4,000 gap between Nevada's per pupil spending amount and the expert recommendation signals a critical underfunding of our students, particularly in a time when education is one of the most powerful investments that we can make for our state's future. So as incredible as this boost was, and it was incredible, education is still not adequately funded, which is what we heard and saw repeatedly throughout our research that we're going to share with you today. So I want to give a little bit of context of what the PCFP is, the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, and where it came from, which is, or where we started, which was the Nevada plan. So the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan was the first shift we saw in how we fund education since 1967. So the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan was not only much needed, but it was also very thoughtfully curated. For context, the Nevada plan was introduced in 1967 when the state was mostly rural. So its main goal was to equalize school funding across the districts by offsetting the local property tax disparities, which was especially prevalent in our fast-growing counties like Clark and Washoe. So the plan, the Nevada plan, guaranteed a base per pupil funding level, which protected districts during periods of declining enrollment. So that was important. However, over time, it struggled to keep up with how diverse the student populations were becoming in Nevada. And those needs were evolving, which led to major inequities between schools and districts. So the revised funding model, which is the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, was introduced in 2019 through Senate Bill 543, and it was fully implemented in 2021. This plan was a large shift, and the way that it works is by consolidating state and local revenues to ensure that funding is allocated equitably based on individual student needs. So the goal is that funds now follow the student more closely to their specific school, and it's focused on distributing resources more fairly. The PCFP also includes safeguards to ensure that there's stable funding, adjust for inflation, the higher operational costs in rural and frontier areas, and all of those important factors as well. So to kind of explain generally how the PCFP works and how our schools are funded, this is how I typically explain it. PCFP funds are state funds, so they are allocated at the state level. They are then distributed to the district based on school enrollment numbers. And those are then the districts, other than CCSD, which I will get into in 1 second, other than CCSD, the districts then make funding decisions based on teachers, student needs, what those schools look like, and what the needs of those students are. So as I said, the exception to this is CCSD. Instead of funding decisions being made at the district level in CCSD, state funds are funneled through CCSD to the schools, and therefore principals have significant autonomy over then how these funds are spent. So in most schools across the state, school funding decisions are made at the district level. However, in CCSD, most of those decisions are made at the school level. We'll get into the specific numbers in a future slide, but for now, I'd just like to note that there is a base amount for every student in Nevada, and then there are weighted categories that allow for additional funds to be allocated, and that is in order to provide for interventions, additional teachers, or support to the students within those categories. So these large changes to Nevada's funding model led us to ask some questions, and these included, how did the PCFP impact English learner, special education, GATE, and at-risk students? How has the implementation of the PCFP impacted the equitable distribution of resources across Nevada's diverse school districts? What are differences in educational funding between urban and rural schools? And then what about state public charter school authority schools? What are the relationships between funding and student performance? And then how do principals and district leaders perceive PCFP impacts? So in order to answer these questions, we conducted a mixed method study that involved both quantitative and qualitative analyses. So on the quantitative side, we used data from NDE and the Nevada Report Card to conduct analyses on funding and enrollment information for elementary schools and their corresponding districts. And then based on this data, we developed a GIS tool that visualizes how all of these factors play out at the school level. We also integrated census and community data to get a bigger picture for all of the contextual factors that impact student success, because we know funding is not the only determinant for student success. Fortunately, we will be previewing that tool at the end of our presentation today, so stay tuned for that. So in addition to the data side of our research, we also conducted interviews with school principals and district superintendents and CFOs to gain a better perspective on how these funds are actually impacting schools and the students within them. So first, I'd like to focus on how the PCFP impacted English learner, special education, GATE, and at-risk students. And I'll explain why those are the categories we are looking at right now. So the base funding for all students in 2024 was $8,966. This is the amount that all students receive. Then there are 3 weighted categories that if a student qualifies, they will receive an additional allocation. Those categories are English learner, GATE, and students at risk of not graduating. So those are our 3 weighted categories. So the PCFP addresses these populations of students by providing an additional percentage in addition to that base funding for students within these categories. So for a GATE student, they would receive an additional 12% per pupil. For English learner students, it would be an additional 45%. And then for at-risk students, an additional 35%. I want to quickly mention special education. So special education students are funded based on their actual costs, not a set weight. However, we included special education along with the weighted categories in our analysis because if a student qualifies for special education services and therefore they receive special education funding, they are not able to receive the additional funding for any of these other weighted categories. So therefore, we thought it was important to include them. A student can only receive additional funding in the highest of the weighted categories if they do qualify for multiple. So if you have a student that is an English language learner and is gifted and talented, they will only receive that additional funding for qualifying as an EL student. For this research, we utilized data from 2022, and I want to note this because it was prior to the shift in what is meant to be an at-risk student, and therefore the quantity of students who received at-risk funding in our research appears to be much greater than what it is under this new definition. However, I also want to note that the amount per student has also shifted. So although there are significantly less students that qualify for the at-risk funding under this new definition, the amount of funding per student is now much higher. So next, we're going to talk about how the implementation of the PCFP has impacted the equitable distribution of resources across Nevada's school districts. So currently, 43% of Nevada's students receive either weighted or special education funding, and the remaining 57% receive that standard base funding. I'd like to, this map or this visual is great to be able to visualize how this funding plays out across our districts in Nevada. But what I would like to do is kind of pinpoint some major takeaways or key findings from our quantitative analyses based on this data. So for special education, it was the most evenly dispersed across the districts, meaning that enrollment numbers are the most consistent across districts for each of the additional funding categories. For our GATE analyses were very interesting because what we found is that the GATE numbers appear to be very low, especially in rural and smaller school districts. However, what we learned is that actually many smaller and rural school districts have GATE programs, but they don't receive the state funding, and therefore they don't show up in the PCFP numbers because they're not state accredited GATE programs. And when we asked further about this, we learned that it is not that their programs are any less rigorous, but it's actually that they just don't have the capacity administratively to maintain the state GATE program requirements. And so therefore they kind of have their own version of state programs, but they don't get funded in the same way that other schools do. And then let's talk a little bit about this at-risk category. This new definition means that we expect these numbers to shrink drastically from what we see now. This new definition cuts the number of students receiving additional funding from over 250,000 to about 60,000. I do want to note that about 90,000 still qualify, but because they are receiving funding from a different category, only 60,000 are actually going to receive that at-risk funding. One other thing with the at-risk category that came up several times is how to target interventions. We heard from principals and school administrators that because they don't know what factors Infinite Campus is using to populate their students to qualify them for at-risk funding, they aren't even sure that they are targeting the interventions to meet the needs of the students that fall into these categories. So the way that at-risk calculations are made is that there are 75 factors that are created into this algorithm through Infinite Campus that generates this grad score. And based on where you fall within this grad score, they take the lowest 20th percentile to then those students then qualify for at-risk funding. The problem is that schools not only don't know exactly what those 75 factors are, but they don't know where those students fall within those 75 factors. So when they try to implement programs that would be targeted interventions for the students that need them, they don't know what those needs are. It could be that they are low income. That might be one of the factors. It might be that they have moved several times in the last several years. Those interventions would be very different for a student, and without knowing what the needs are of the students based on those 75 factors, it's difficult to target interventions. In addition to that, kind of similarly, what we heard is that without knowing what those data points are, those 75 factors, it's difficult to know whether the schools are even accurately keeping up with that data. Data collection is a problem that we saw over and over again on the student level, school level, district level, and state level. And it's something we talk about a lot in our research and a major place for improvement. But schools reported that they recently learned that the amount of visits that the student takes to the nurse is one of the 75 factors. However, they did not have updated, they kept records of their nurse visits. They did not put those into Infinite Campus, and therefore that was not populated for data for that student as to whether they'd qualify for at-risk funding. And then finally, what we heard is that because this funding feels that it could change as it has several times, administrators are fearful to use it for permanent positions, such as individuals to target behavioral health concerns, because it feels fleeting in that sense. So next, we are going to talk about what the biggest differences in funding between urban and rural schools, and then how charters play a role in this as well. So although there are notable differences between weighted funding in rural and urban schools, the largest takeaway we noted was a lack of data for charters and rural schools. And I just mentioned this, and it will come up again and again. And what happens is that these comparisons may not fully represent the actual findings and percentages for each of these categories because there was just significant missing data for our rurals and charters. And what we found is a lot of that is due to lack of administrative support and the need for that administrative support to maintain these data profiles. So next we asked, what are the relationships between funding and student performance? I am not going to get too deep into this, and there are a few reasons for that. First, I want to note that it is far too early for us to be tracking performance based on funding decisions that are really, really new. It is just too early for us to be doing that. It would not be I think ethically correct for us to be drawing any type of conclusions. However, I think it is good for us to start looking at these relationships so that we can track them over time. And so this can kind of be a starting place for that. I also want to note that performance should potentially be re-examined to consider more than our current metrics of absenteeism and test scores and things like that. Those are important issues, but when we're talking about student performance, there are a lot of conversations that are taking place right now about what do we consider student performance? How can we measure things outside of standardized tests to really think about a student achievement? And then finally, student performance is dependent on many, many factors. And if we link it too closely with allocated funding, it could be problematic. So I just want to make note of that before we start looking at these connections between the data and student performance. So with that being said, we are going to just dive into kind of two different pieces of funding and performance. I want to spend more time on this second piece that I'm going to talk about, and that's the connections between at-risk populations and chronic absenteeism. But we did do preliminary analyses for performance, so I'll lay some of that foundation here. The goal is that these could be built upon in years to come to track performance and school funding alongside each other. And what we found is that school size played the largest role in the strengths of relationships between weighted student populations and performance metrics. So as you can see here, large schools have strong positive relationships between weighted student percentages and absenteeism, but negative relationships with test scores. So that means as weighted enrollment tends to increase, test scores tend to decrease. For mid-sized schools, that relationship decreases slightly, and then it continues to go down for small schools where the relationship between weighted student enrollment and test scores is very weak. So although the impact of the PCFP on performance is still too recent to really quantify, initial findings reveal a strong correlation, about 74%, between at-risk enrollment and chronic absenteeism rates in urban schools. This relationship is much more pronounced than the correlation between test scores and either at-risk enrollment or absenteeism. So chronic absenteeism, I know, is a very hot topic, and it's one that we care a lot about and hope to look at in the future in more depth, but it is defined as students missing 10% or more of student days annually, and this is regardless of whether the absence is excused or unexcused. And the connections to that and at-risk enrollment is significant, particularly in urban areas like Las Vegas and Reno-Sparks. So in the Las Vegas area, at-risk enrollment and chronic absenteeism rates closely mirror each other. And then there are similar but less pronounced patterns through Reno. And then in contrast, rural districts show a weaker correlation between at-risk enrollment and absenteeism, as well as less of a relationship between low test scores and absenteeism compared to urban areas. So after our interviews with school principals and district leaders, we aim to narrow down the themes of those interviews to understand how they perceive the impacts of the PCFP. So the four main themes that we took from this is first, district control of PCFP funds. Most principals reported very little budgetary control, with staffing decisions primarily being made at the district level. And although those allocations hadn't significantly changed with the PCFP shift, districts generally remained responsive to school needs, especially for EL and Title I funds. Second is that the perception of the PCFP was pretty much budget neutral, which is a good thing that principals did not observe major program or staffing changes under the PCFP. And I do want to note that some of the schools we interviewed were held harmless, which means that their budget changes were delayed, but overall resources appear to be consistent year to year, which is a very positive thing. Next, recruitment and retention of instructional staff. They all reported that this was a major concern. It came up in every single interview. And I especially want to note this because we did not ask about recruitment and retention in any of our questions, and it came up in every single interview. So this is certainly a focus. And principals over and over again talked about prioritizing staffing and recognizing how much it impacts the school morale and overall climate, and just the difficulty in filling those positions, even when they are funded. And then finally, their post-pandemic, principals observed an increased social and emotional and behavioral challenges among students and their families, and just the need to have targeted interventions that are really supportive of students post-pandemic. So some of our main takeaways from this research is, although the PCFP was significant in so many ways and made huge strides in equity for school funding, the bottom line is that school funding is still inadequate and there is still work to do and research to be done. And more specifically, ensuring equitable distribution of funds is still an issue. The goal of the PCFP is commonly stated as, the money following the student. But what we learned from all levels of administration is that this is nearly impossible, and so therefore it is not taking place. Coming back to the data piece, there is not uniform guidance on how to allocate funds. And so this is specifically an issue with the at-risk category because although every principal outside of CCSD that we spoke to, they had never heard of the PCFP and did not know that these weighted categories existed within their schools. And so the dynamic channels of communication are really, really important because it's important that districts are making decisions on behalf of the principals that reflect student needs. So that downward communication is important, but then the upward communication of communicating the student needs upward so that the decisions reflect that is critical. And then finally, the pandemic intensified all of these needs. And when we're considering funding in the future, it's important to consider the exacerbated needs that now exist. So some of our policy considerations, I'm not going to go in depth on these. However, they are very nicely laid out in our report and discussed in depth. However, a couple of key policy considerations are, the first one is involving standardized reporting and data collection. This is something I've already talked about several times in this webinar, but introducing mandatory standardized guidance for financial data reporting is critical. And then creating a centralized statewide data system for tracking this funding, student well-being, community factors, all of the things that would impact student achievement. And then making sure that it's accessible for people, that we are able to utilize this data to better our schools and students. Consistency and transparency in funding distribution, providing that clear guidance on how weighted funding can be spent. And then principal training and knowing how to fund or how to spend these funds and what interventions their students might need. Continual research and longitudinal studies on, especially in regard to those performance metrics, and performance metrics that go beyond test scores to include student well-being and community engagement. And then also integrating stakeholder data and feedback in order to inform these ongoing policy adjustments. And then next, as I've mentioned, student needs are increasing and family needs are increasing. So really thinking about how we can utilize additional funding, maybe even through that at-risk funding, to ensure that emotional learning, social and emotional learning, and mental health services are provided to our students who need it. And then finally, ensuring equity in funding allocations. So conducting equity audits and promoting transparency in funding decisions, and expanding incentive programs to attract teachers to hard to staff areas, implementing mentorship programs, and ultimately just ensuring that education is adequately funded for sustainable improvements. Now, I know this slide is a lot, so I just want to preview it because it is one of the features of our report that I think is a really powerful visual. And these are our school profiles. So what you see on the left is a school profile that involves, on the top, school factors, and then on the bottom, community indicators. And both of these can just kind of paint a picture for what the schools and the students that are in those schools kind of look like. And then on the right is, when we interviewed these schools, we created kind of this mini school profile, and then you have kind of the narrative or takeaway for the interviews that we conducted. So finally, now the exciting part, I want to introduce Robin and also give just some slight context of how we envision this GIS tool to be utilized. So Robin Evans is the Guinn Center's incredible GIS specialist, and we are so grateful for her work on this project. So she's going to preview the tool, but what I want to share is the GIS portion is twofold. So first, there's a story map that serves as kind of the summary for the report, and it also highlights some of the key takeaways and prominent sections in a visual way. And then second, there's a full GIS tool that allows you to track funding, performance, and community metrics in a single place. So the ways we think this might be utilized: by school administrators to look at resource allocation analysis and to identify disparities, look at program funding assessment to see if the services fit the community's needs, potentially for chronic absenteeism tracking and trends or connections, and then for policy makers for trend analyses, for disparities in weighted funding. And this ultimately provides the data for data-based decisions. So we hope that it's useful for that. And then for researchers, we hope that this will inspire continual evaluation and tracking of these metrics. And then finally, for parents, this should assist with school funding transparency and performance monitoring. So these are some of the ways that we hope this tool can be utilized. But now I want to turn it over to Robin, who will share this tool with you all.
All right, hello. Let me get our GIS website up for you. Right. As Anna mentioned, we have two portions within the GIS site. The first is our story map, and the second are detailed maps that you can view. The story map begins with a guided experience called the story map, which highlights key trends and findings from the report. It also serves an introduction to the interactive maps in terms of content and navigation techniques. Navigation tips and legends are available throughout the map. We will talk about the maps themselves in a little bit more detail later, so we're just gonna, run through that. This map and many of the others within the story map and also within the report follow the same color scheme. High values in percent are in yellow and low percents are in purple, with average values in white. This particular map shows students with weighted funding in any category by percent. easily scroll along. And then at any time, you are free to click on individual schools for additional information, or to zoom around the map to areas of interest. However, this isn't required. You can simply continue the guided experience because all of these maps are available to view in detail later. The story map follows the contents and findings of the report, including district level data and school level data for weighted category enrollment. This chart that is loading is one that we have seen earlier. However, it is interactive within the story map environment. When you zoom over an area, you can see greater detail about student enrollments rates. And if you click on the corner, you can expand to view any of the resources in greater detail. Weighted category enrollment maps are available for special education students, English learners, at-risk enrollments, and gate enrollments. And within the story map environment, we do concentrate on areas that have significantly high or low values of student enrollments, and those that are of particular interest identified during our study. We also have an interactive map for weighted funding that we will explain in a bit more detail under the mapping tab, comparing rates of funding for a category enrollment to the number of students enrolled in a category. And sample schools are available to highlight interesting trends or specific data. And again, we have graphs available for the district level as well. We touch on performance relationships briefly with one of the primary relationships identified during the report, showing the percent of at-risk students compared to chronic absenteeism rates. As we mentioned before, there was a 74% correlation between urban areas. And as you see, when you move the slider, the two types of data values, the colors stay fairly consistent, which shows just a visual representation of what we were talking about in charts and graphs earlier, so you can see for yourself what a relationship of that level looks like. And in comparison, the rural areas with a 26% or much lower relationship, you see there's quite a bit of difference in the color change value. So this was one of the interesting things you can see in an interactive map that wouldn't be visible in a paper map or report environment. We also touched briefly on school experiences, which highlights several of our sample schools discussing their unique experiences with the PCFP, highlighting school data, and also some of the demographics that were gathered during the apportionment process, and mapping school funding. After completing the story map, you are invited to explore maps in more detail in our mapping tab. Right. This is our mapping section of the GIS tool. And there are two types of maps within the mapping tool. The first type is really maps that are intended to be viewed at the close level to look at an individual school or those in close proximity of a school. The second type of map is intended to view trends at the state level, district, city level, something to that effect at the larger level. Depending on your screen size at any time, you can minimize our introduction tab, or you can use the search bar to look for an individual school or an area of interest. For this particular map, we are looking at the student enrollment rates, each primary funding category. And when you click on a school, you can get an interactive pop-up where you can see the quantity of students that are receiving standard-based funding in terms of the actual number of students and the percent of the total student body. I do apologize if things look a little small on your screen. I have a large screen in front of me, so I'm not sure what you're seeing, but you can see. But each funding category is available as you mouse over. Our second map, the school overview, we saw briefly in the story map, where we compare the quantity of funding a school receives to the quantity of students that are in a special funding, weighted funding, or special education category. For example, when we click on Matt Kelly Elementary School, we see that almost 54% of students are in the at-risk category, and only approximately 15% are in special education, which is on the first pie chart. But when we look at the funding ring, we see that special education makes up a far larger percent of the school funding, and that is simply because special education is a much more expensive program to run and administer compared to at-risk students. And this data is available for every school. If we go down to the second chart, you can see the actual dollar values that are allocated for each primary funding category, as well as total school funding and the Title I funding for each school. And our third resource is called the funding dashboard. At any time, you can move these around depending on your screen size or needs or interest. We start off with a map of the total per pupil funding relative to the state average specified in the Nevada report card. At the time, it was 11,300 at the time of our study. And schools that have above average values have a yellow circle with a purple arrow, and below average is a purple circle and yellow arrow. One thing that is fun about this map, as you zoom in, up to 8 schools within the map view are displayed in the graphs below. And as you mouse over the graphs, you can see the data values for each chart. For the graphs available to us, we have the percent of average for pupil state funding in Nevada, and this shows whether it is above or below the state average state funding, as well as above or below the federal funding level in Nevada for average values. And we show the weighted funding as a percent of total funding at a school, and then the average Title I funding per pupil. You can also click on any school to see additional information about their allocations. It is important to remember that these are just allocations and do not necessarily reflect exactly what the school receives. These funds are administered by the district. This is simply what is allocated. Right. Our next section, called Student Data Trends, starts with an introduction, and then you're invited to choose any map layer of your choice, one at a time, with the description of the data below. This sort of map that is best viewed at a larger level to view larger data trends. So you have all of our special funding categories, including special education, English learners, at-risk, GATE, and then we also have chronic absenteeism rates that you can view. And again, you can click on any school at a time for additional information. Our next item is perhaps the one I think is the most fun. This is our Compare Student Data Trends map. And as you can see, these maps are linked. If you click on any map, the others will follow. Within this map, you can view special education, English learners, at-risk enrollment, and gate enrollments compared to one another, and you can see where areas of high and low enrollment are at the same time, which I think is just a lot of fun and very interesting to see where high and low concentrations exist. And lastly, we have our sample school profiles, which were also touched on briefly today. You can go to the list and select any sample school of your choice, either by name, or you can filter by school district. When you click on a school, you're going to see a map that shows the attendance boundaries for that school, as well as the school's location. These attendance boundaries are what we were using to apportion data, our economic indicators. The data apportioned either comes from the American Community Survey 5-year estimates from 2018 to 2022, or from the 2020 census. And if you're not familiar with the ACS, it is a census product, an official survey from the census that covers a 5-year period. And this was the period during the time of our study. You are interested in where these boundaries lie. Boundaries were either gathered from the individual schools or from the school district, or from existing GIS data when available, as well from the school district. And you can also expand the school profiles to see those a little bit closer up if you choose to do so. Right, and that completes our GIS tour of the mapping section.
Thank you so much, Robin, for sharing this incredible tool with us. You can go ahead and unshare your screen. Perfect. Thank you so much. And Anna, if you wouldn't mind putting up our final slide as we get ready to transition into our time of Q&A. I want to invite everyone on the call to use the Q&A tool to submit any burning questions that you may have in regard to this study. And in regard to Anna's research and Robin's work with the GIS tool. One more comment on the GIS tool. It's of course linked in the chat for you, as is the full report. But it is one thing to read data points. It's another thing to immerse yourself and experience them. And I do want to thank Robin for her incredible work in allowing us to experience these data in such a powerful way. So Anna, we'll go ahead and start with a warm-up question for you before we dig into what our attendees are curious about. If you could, please share with us what surprised you the most about your analysis on this project.
Great question and a fun one. There were a lot of really interesting findings in this research. I will say maybe the most surprising is that in speaking with our principals across the state, we quickly learned that that funding decisions or any school-based decisions that involve funding are not made at the school level, and therefore principals are just not familiar with how their schools are funded or the decisions that are being made kind of on their school's behalf. And it doesn't end there though. In the conversation, we learned that a lot of principals are really grateful for that because they have a ton on their plate. So to not have the burden of knowing pieces of budgetary decisions that are very complex, very complicated is actually quite a relief for them. But I think that it does highlight this need to have increased channels of communications to ensure that the principals who are the most familiar with what their student needs are and what is happening on the school level, that they are communicating upward what those needs are so that the decisions that are being made on the district level reflect the needs on the school level.
Absolutely. And digging into that communication, digging into, perhaps what differences of needs may exist across schools, across districts in the state. I'd like to put a finer point, perhaps on the differences between urban schools and rural schools. I'm curious if your analysis revealed any key differences between the needs of our schools in urban versus rural areas.
Yes and no. What is interesting is that increased student needs and teacher shortages came up across the board in every conversation. So the increased needs exist everywhere. I think our rurals have unique needs that came up, and there are adjustments in the funding for that. So it is considered in the pupil-centered funding plan to make sure that those needs are considered, the unique needs of rurals. But what we did find is that CCSD is just very unique. So that is one, key urban finding, is that they have a very unique structure for funding and the autonomy that principals have over their budgets. And that comes at a cost sometimes. That means that principals do need to be running these small businesses or pretty large businesses, because these budgets are large, on their own, and know how to manage that and resource allocation and the best way to spend these resources, which is quite taxing on those principals. So I think that there are benefits both ways, and this isn't an argument of which way is better. It's more so pointing out that these differences exist across our state, and are we aware of that when making policy decisions on how funding is allocated across the state?
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for illuminating some of those differences and considerations for the future, and of course for future research as well. So turning to student outcomes, which I know is a little bit of a tricky topic, and you did such a fantastic job qualifying, contextualizing that for us, that with the pupil-centered funding plan, it could simply be a little bit too soon to make too many conclusions about funding and its connection to student performance. But one of our guests' questions is about at what point we might be able to start tracking student performance outcomes.
Yeah.
And this person notes that it could be something that we can compare using year-over-year test scores, and that could be a good indicator of outcomes. What is your comment on that?
I think this is a great topic, because although I do quantify or qualify the fact that it is very early to be linking funding too closely to performance, and sometimes when we make funding decisions and we're like, hey, we want to see results right away, and that's just not how things work. And so I think it's important to have that conversation, but I don't think it's too early to start tracking that data. And that's what we've done in this report, is we have tracked the data. We have started making those connections, because as this person asked, it's important to look at that over time, and the only way we can do that is if we have a starting point. So I think we hope that this research serves as kind of a starting point for that, so that we can see these trends over time. I think what I heard a little bit through this question is there's a bigger question of what are we tracking, and what are we linking to to funding, and what are we considering student performance? And these are the questions that are taking place and that really excite me, because I think there are so many factors that impact student performance, and how can we better capture those, or more fully capture those, because we know that a test score is not the only thing that demonstrates student performance. And how can we better capture all of the ways that students perform and achieve in a way that is understood by society and the workforce and our population in general? Because that's the key part here, is if our workforce skills are changing, how can we think about student performance in a way that would then match the needs of our future employers? I could talk about that for quite some time, but I think leaving it there might be my better option.
Thank you, Anna. And for the sake of time, I want to point out that Anna has availed herself. Her email is on this slide right in front of you. If you have questions about her project that come to mind after this webinar is over. And I know we're coming to a bit of a close here, but I do want to flag two more questions before we close things down. So we have a couple of questions in regard to the GIS tool and our data collection. So one question is focused on when the data was collected. This GIS tool is this GIS tool based on data from fiscal year 2022? Is it the intent of the Guinn Center to update the GIS tool with data beyond fiscal year 2022?
Great question. So yes, that is when our data was collected, or the data we utilized was from 2022. And we do hope that this will be a long-term project where we can look at this over time and track these things over time. So the idea, hopefully, that we will be able to update this and keep it going so that we can see how these things change over time.
All right, thank you so much. And I know we're a bit over time, but just to close things out, we do have another question, and I'm going to go ahead and read it verbatim since there's a little bit of context to it. So I'm interested in outcomes compared to funding. For example, I believe Utah has about $10,000 per student in funding and has had good outcomes. Can we compare the student scores and outcomes by state? Also, can we include for those with good outcomes and smaller funding? And how do they accomplish that?
Yes, please do a study. I would love to. That is not in the scope of this research. We really wanted to kind of deep dive PCFP, look at it in detail. However, I would love to now take this on a more, national level and look at what are other states doing, what are they doing well, what were challenges that they overcame, and how can we learn from them? And I would love to look at that further. There are states that are doing really good research. That would be a very in-depth complex study, because these are not things that you could just get from numbers. We would have to be having these conversations, potentially looking at what is happening on the school level, and having those observations, because as we've talked about, these things are very contextual. They are not just let's link a test score to this amount that they fund. There are a lot of additional things that impact student achievement that I would love to look at further from other states.
All right. And Anna, that is a wonderful place to leave this conversation on a hopeful note that more research is, of course, to come. And, the Guinn Center, relies on several sources of funding to do its research. But one of them is philanthropy and donations from people like you and organizations like the ones that you represent to help facilitate the work that we do and to fulfill our mission. And so we do invite and encourage those conversations about support, and we invite your partnership as well to keep these engines going. As we close today, I again want to invite you to reach out to us with any further questions. And if we didn't get to your question today, please don't worry. It's our intention to answer any remaining questions in a forthcoming article on our website. So you can look for that in the next coming weeks. Also, I want to draw your attention to the two QR codes that you see in front of you. One is to read and download the full report on the Pupil-Centered funding plan. It does include a link to that GIS tool so you can further explore. Also, if you wouldn't mind completing a brief survey on today's webinar to let us know how we can improve these experiences for you in the future. We'd be so grateful for your feedback. With that, I thank everyone for attending today's call. I invite you again to visit our website for more information about our mission, our vision, and giving to our mission, as well as all of our research. Thank you so much to everyone again, and we will see you again soon.